For thousands of years, the greatest military powers on Earth made the exact same mistake, over and over again. They marched onto the Iranian plateau with swords drawn, absolutely certain they could erase this civilization from the map forever. The Macedonian phalanxes of Alexander the Great invaded here. Ruthless Roman legions marched here. Arab armies swept in under the banner of a new religion. And the ferocious Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan tore through, leaving behind, by some medieval accounts, towers of skulls. Almost any other nation, after absorbing blows like these, would have simply disappeared, dissolved into the great cultural melting pot of history.
The way the Babylonians, the Hittites, and the Assyrians eventually did, their languages died, their gods were forgotten, their names survive only in museum inscriptions. But with Iran, something strange kept happening. Time after time, despite losing on the battlefield, despite losing their capitals, despite generations of occupation, the Iranians pulled off something almost no other conquered people in history has managed so many times in a row. They outlasted their conquerors. Within a few generations, the invaders were speaking Persian, building Persian-style architecture, running a Persian-style bureaucracy, and, in more than one case, dressing like Persian kings.
Again and again, a plateau in the middle of Asia seemed to quietly absorb the armies sent to destroy it. So how did Iran manage, from antiquity to the present day, to force nearly every major world power to reckon with it? How did it preserve an identity through empire after empire, invasion after invasion? And how is it that Persia, a country with a 5,000-year history and a name known across the entire globe, one day simply told the world to stop using that name and start calling it Iran instead? This is the story of a nation that helped invent the very idea of linear time that much of the modern world still lives inside, turned geopolitics into a struggle between light and darkness, and learned over and over how to lose battles in order to win centuries.
Along the way, we'll meet a king who was murdered by a grieving steppe queen, a Greek conqueror who ended up dressing like the empire he destroyed, an army of nomads on horseback who arrived speaking no Persian at all and left 2 generations later building blue-domed mosques and reciting Persian poetry. And we'll end with a modern nation that in the space of a single generation deliberately renamed itself in front of the entire world and is still, in many ways, arguing with itself about what that name should mean. To understand this civilization, we have to rewind much further than most people expect. The Western imagination usually treats Mesopotamia, Sumer, and Babylon, or ancient Egypt as the cradle of civilization. Iran is often pushed to the margins of that story, treated as a supporting character in someone else's history. That is a serious distortion.
Human habitation on the Iranian plateau goes back tens of thousands of years. Neanderthal groups lived across these mountains and valleys. Later, anatomically modern humans moved in and gradually replaced them. But the real transformation, the shift from scattered communities to organized urban life, began much later, and it began early by world standards. Archaeologists have identified early complex settlements on Iranian territory, including the Bronze Age Jiroft culture in the southeast, associated with elaborate carved chlorite vessels, and early ziggurat-style temple platforms, such as the one at Sialk. Painted pottery traditions on the Iranian plateau date back to at least the 5th and 4th millennia BC. None of this makes Iran the cradle of civilization instead of Mesopotamia, but it does mean that organized settlement here developed in parallel with, and in constant contact with, Sumer right from the start. The first major political power to emerge from this world was Elam, centered in the southwest of modern Iran, with its capital at Susa. Elam was powerful enough that, by the 26th century BC, it was already a serious rival, and at times a dominant force in relations with the Sumerian city-states to its west. One especially remarkable episode comes from the 23rd century BC, when the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon of Akkad, went to war with Elam. The conflict ended not simply with the usual pattern of tribute and threats, but with something written down, a treaty, inscribed in the Elamite language, discovered at Susa. In it, an Elamite ruler, probably a king named Hita, swore loyalty to Naram-Sin. The enemy of Naram-Sin is my enemy. The friend of Naram-Sin is my friend. Under its terms, Elam supplied troops to the Akkadian king. A royal marriage sealed the alliance, and Akkadian language and administration took deep root in Susa. For decades afterward, Elam oscillated between two roles, sometimes a rival power capable of dictating terms to the Sumerian cities to its west, sometimes a subordinate partner absorbed into someone else's empire. In miniature, that back and forth previews the entire rest of Iranian history. Political power on this plateau would keep changing hands, dynasty after
Dynasty, empire after empire. What stayed constant for 5,000 years was the land's stubborn ability to remain a center of gravity that no neighboring power could simply conquer, digest, and forget. This is not, strictly speaking, the very first written treaty in human history. An even older one survives between the cities of Ebla and Abarsal in Syria from around 2350 BC. But the Naram-Sin-Elam Treaty is one of the oldest surviving diplomatic documents on Earth, and it places the Iranian plateau from the very beginning at the center of the world's oldest tradition of written diplomacy, even if, in this particular case, that diplomacy meant submission rather than independence. Elam had been pulled into Akkad's orbit, its language pushed aside in official documents, its temples reshaped by a foreign king. It's an early preview of a much larger pattern. This land would be conquered again and again, and each time it would find ways to bend the story back toward itself. Genetically and culturally, the Elamites were closely tied to the peoples of Mesopotamia. The people we think of today as Iranians, speakers of Iranian languages, arrived on the plateau later in a long, staggered migration between roughly the 20th and 15th centuries BC. Nomadic, horse and cattle herding tribes began moving south out of the steppes of Central Asia and the Caucasus, part of the vast Indo-European family of peoples, whose languages eventually spread from Ireland to India. These particular migrants belonged to its Indo-Iranian branch, distant linguistic cousins of the Greeks, the Latins, the Germanic and Slavic peoples, and much later of English and Spanish speakers on the other side of the planet. Settling across the plateau, these newcomers called themselves Aryas, noble ones, and their new home, Arianum Viaja, the expanse of the Aryans. Over 3,000 years, through sound changes across Old, Middle, and New Persian, that phrase eventually produced the word we use today, Iran. The migrating tribes mixed with the older population of Elam and split into several major groups, the most historically significant of which were the Medes and the Persians. It was in these harsh mountains and deserts that the most important weapon in Iranian history was forged. It wasn't a chariot. It wasn't a bow. It was an idea. Long before Christianity, long before Islam, a prophet on the Iranian plateau, traditionally known as Zoroaster or Zarathustra, preached a religion that restructured how an entire civilization understood existence. Zoroastrianism. For the ancient Iranian believer, life was not a meaningless sequence of accidents, nor a simple cycle of returning seasons, as it was for many neighboring cultures. The universe was the stage of a real, total, ongoing war between Ahura Mazda, the god of light, truth, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of deception and darkness. Zoroastrian cosmology gave this war a geography, too, casting the vast nomadic steppe of Eurasia, Turan in later Persian legend, as a symbolic homeland of chaos and raiding, against which Iran stood as the champion of order. To be Iranian in this worldview was to be enlisted, whether you liked it or not, on the side of light. Poetry, kingship, agriculture, irrigation, all of it was framed as active participation in the cosmic struggle against disorder. That gave the early Iranian world a form of ideological unity that pure military conquest could never have produced on its own. But Zoroastrianism's most consequential legacy wasn't the war of light against dark. It was something quieter, and in the long run, far more explosive. The idea that time itself moves in a straight line. Time is not a wheel. The world had a beginning, an act of creation, and it will have an end, a final cosmic battle,
a purification by fire, a last judgment in which every soul answers for what it did. This picture of history, beginning, middle, apocalyptic end, was almost entirely new in the ancient world, where cyclical time dominated most religious thought.
How did an idea born on the Iranian plateau end up shaping half the planet's religious imagination? The bridge was historical, not mystical. In the 6th century BC, Persian forces under Cyrus the Great took Babylon and freed the Jewish community that had been held there in captivity. Judea then spent roughly 2 centuries as a province of the Persian Empire. During this long, close contact, Jewish religious thought absorbed elements of Zoroastrian eschatology, the anticipation of an end of days, a linear unfolding of history, a final judgment. From there, these ideas flowed onward into Christianity and later into Islam. Even modern philosophers, Friedrich Nietzsche among them, in his own idiosyncratic way through the figure of Zarathustra, acknowledged Zoroaster's outsized role in shaping how humans came to imagine time itself, not as a circle we repeat, but as a line we walk once. The religion also gave Iranian civilization its enduring visual fire as a symbol of purity and divine truth, tended by priests in dedicated fire temples that never let the flame go out. The winged disc representing Ahura Mazda's presence, later carved above the tombs of Achaemenid kings at Naxxurustam. The ritual of the 2 priests standing before the sacred flame, feeding it with dried wood while chanting the Avesta's ancient hymns. Even after Islam became the majority religion many centuries later, this Zoroastrian visual and moral vocabulary, the opposition of light and darkness, purity and corruption, order and chaos, never fully disappeared from Iranian culture. It resurfaces constantly in Persian poetry, in royal symbolism, and in the way Iranians of many faiths still talk about truth, honesty, and civic virtue today. The first genuinely powerful Iranian-speaking state was Media, traditionally dated to around 670 BC, centered in the northwest of the plateau around the city of Ecbatana, near modern Hamadan. The Medes did not last as an independent great power for very long, but while they lasted, they accomplished something enormous. Allied with Babylon under King Nabopolassar, they besieged and destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC, ending centuries of Assyrian domination over the Near East and permanently removing what had been, for generations, the single most feared military power in the ancient world. Media's own hegemony, though, was cut short from within by its own close relatives, the Persians, who had until then lived as a subordinate vassal kingdom under Median overlordship in the south of the plateau.
In 550 BC, a Persian prince named Cyrus, Persian on one side of his family, Median on the other, rose up against his Median overlord, united the Persian and Median peoples under his own rule, and began building what historians consider the world's first true superpower, the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus broke the mold of ancient conquest. When he took Lydia in Asia Minor, and especially when he took Babylon itself, he did not raise temples or enslave conquered populations wholesale, as many earlier empires had. He positioned himself as a restorer of order and local religion. The Cyrus cylinder, a famous clay inscription from Babylon, describes him returning displaced peoples and cult statues to their homes. He built an empire, at least in its early phase, that ruled through restraint and multicultural respect as much as force. His successor, Darius I, pushed the empire.
But for all his triumphs, Cyrus's story ends in catastrophe. Pushing to secure the empire's northeastern frontier, he led an army into Central Asia against the Massagetai, a fierce nomadic confederation. The campaign ended in disaster. The Persian army was crushed, and Cyrus himself was killed. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, whose account should be read as dramatic legend as much as verified fact, the Massagetai's queen, Tomyris, seeking revenge for the death of her son, had Cyrus's body found, cut off his head, and thrust it into a skin filled with human blood, declaring, "You thirsted for blood? Now drink your fill." Whether every detail of that story is literally true, it captures something real. Even the founder of the greatest empire on earth was not immune to the plateau's oldest lesson. The steppe could not be tamed by force alone. Most people know the story of the Greco-Persian Wars through one lens: The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae in 480 BC holding a mountain pass against the invading army of Xerxes I, the Athenian fleet crushing the Persians at Salamis, the Greek victory at Plataea the following year. These battles were real, they were dramatic, and they mattered enormously to Greek identity. Empire's borders from Egypt in the west to the Indus Valley in the east. At its height, the Achaemenid Empire governed something on the order of 40 to 50 million people, a huge share of the world's entire population at the time. Darius reorganized this sprawling territory into roughly 20 provinces called satrapies, each under a governor answerable to the king. He introduced standardized taxation across the empire, minted gold coins known as darics, and built a network of royal roads, most famously the royal road linking Sardis to Susa, along which mounted royal couriers carried messages faster than almost any postal system in the pre-modern world. Darius also began construction of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital that would later become one of the most spectacular building projects of the ancient world. Forests of stone columns nearly 20 meters tall, monumental stairways carved with processions of tribute bearers representing every subject nation of the empire, and a treasury that stored wealth from Egypt to Central Asia. Persepolis wasn't primarily a place of everyday government. It functioned more as a stage set, built to project the empire's scale and diversity to visiting dignitaries during the springtime Nowruz festival, when representatives of dozens of subject peoples arrived to present gifts to the King of Kings. The empire governed through a policy that, for its era, was strikingly tolerant. Local languages, local religions, and local legal traditions were generally left in place, as long as taxes were paid and loyalty was maintained. This flexible model of empire, unity through administration and infrastructure rather than through forced cultural uniformity, would echo in different forms through nearly every later Iranian dynasty.
But there's a common myth built on top of these battles, the idea that the Greco-Persian Wars broke Persian power. They didn't. For a Greek city-state, Thermopylae and Salamis were existential. For the vast Achaemenid Empire, stretching from the Balkans to India, losing a war on its western fringe was closer to a stinging setback than a mortal wound. And the Persians adapted brilliantly. Rather than throwing more armies at Greece, they switched tactics. They used money instead of swords. Persian gold funded first one Greek faction, then another, Athens, then Sparta, keeping the endlessly quarrelsome Greek city-states fighting each other instead of uniting against Persia. The strategy paid off spectacularly. In 386-387 BC, after a long war fought largely with Persian financing, the exhausted Greek states were forced to accept the so-called King's Peace, dictated on the personal authority of the Persian king Artaxerxes II. Under its terms, the Greek cities of Asia Minor and Cyprus were confirmed as Persian territory, and Sparta was left to police the rest of Greece on Persia's behalf. As one ancient commentator put it, Artaxerxes achieved through diplomacy and gold what Xerxes had failed to achieve with an army. He was, in effect, giving orders in Greece without setting foot on Greek soil. Persia had become the master of Greek politics, without winning a single decisive battle on the Greek mainland afterward.
The real catastrophe came later. Over generations, the Achaemenid Empire's sheer scale, dozens of subject peoples, and overstretched administration, recurring succession crises, left it structurally brittle. A young, ferociously ambitious king from Macedon saw the opening. In 331 BC, Alexander the Great's Macedonian phalanxes crushed the main Achaemenid army at Gaugamela. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, was burned. Whether as calculated retaliation for Xerxes' earlier burning of Athens or in a drunken accident, ancient sources disagree. It looked, for a moment, like the story of ancient Iran was over. Out of the wreckage of the Achaemenid state rose the Hellenistic Seleucid kingdom, ruled by Greek and Macedonian successors of Alexander. And this is exactly where the pattern this documentary keeps returning to first becomes unmistakable. Eastern culture began, quietly and steadily, to absorb its Western conquest. Alexander himself began wearing Persian court dress and adopting Persian royal etiquette even before his death, a policy his own Macedonian officers resented. The broader project of Hellenizing the East ran up against the sheer weight of an older, deeply rooted Iranian worldview, and within a few generations, it was struggling to hold its own culturally, even where it still held political power. Alexander himself died young in Babylon in 323 BC, and his vast, hastily assembled empire immediately fractured among his rival generals. A reminder that conquering the Iranian plateau was one thing, but holding it, governing it, and outlasting it as a foreign power was an entirely different challenge, one that even the most brilliant military mind of antiquity never lived long enough to solve. By the 3rd century BC, the Parthians, an Iranian tribal confederation from the northeast, expelled Greek rule from the Iranian plateau and founded the Parthian Empire. The Parthian king Mithridates I proclaimed himself King of Kings, explicitly claiming continuity with the old Achaemenid title. For roughly 5 centuries, Parthian armies, built around devastatingly effective heavy cavalry and horse archers who could fire backward at full gallop, the famous Parthian shot, held their own against Rome, inflicting one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history on Crassus at Carthage in 53 BC, where the Roman general was killed and, according to later legend, molten gold was poured down his throat in mockery of his greed.
The Parthian period also cemented Iran's role as the essential middle link of the Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting Han China to the Mediterranean world. Chinese silk, Central Asian horses, Indian spices, and Roman glass all passed through Parthian-controlled territory, and Parthian merchants and diplomats deliberately controlled the flow of information about what lay on the other side, acting as gatekeepers between two of the ancient world's great civilizations that otherwise had almost no direct contact with each other. In 224 AD, a new dynasty seized power, the Sasanians, rising from the region of Pars, the ancestral heartland of the first Persians. The Sasanians built a fiercely centralized state in which Zoroastrianism became the official religion of the government itself, not just a widely practiced faith. Society was organized into structured classes: priests, warriors, scribes and bureaucrats, and commoners, creating something closer to a functioning meritocratic administrative hierarchy than most of its contemporaries.
Sassanid Iran became a genuine superpower, locked for nearly 4 centuries in grinding, recurring wars, first with Rome, then with Rome's successor, the Byzantine Empire, for control of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and the trade routes threading between them. This rivalry produced extraordinary art, monumental rock-cut reliefs, and some of the most sophisticated engineering and irrigation works in the ancient world. The Sassanid capital at Ctesiphon featured the Tak Kasra, a single unreinforced brick vault so enormous that it remained for over 1,000 years, one of the largest such structures ever built anywhere on Earth. Sassanid kings founded the Great Academy of Gandeshapur, where Greek, Indian, and Persian medical and philosophical traditions were translated and studied side by side, a direct ancestor of the Great Translation movement that would later flourish under the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. It also, over centuries, bled both empires dry, leaving them dangerously exposed just as an entirely new power was gathering strength to their south. By the middle of the 7th century, the Sassanid Empire was an exhausted giant, weakened by decades of war with Byzantium and internal political instability. A new, unprecedented force erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula, the armies of the early Islamic Caliphate. In 651 AD, the last Sassanid capital fell, and the last Sassanid king, Yazdegerd III, was killed while fleeing eastward. All of Iran came under Arab Muslim rule, first under the Umayyad Caliphate. The Arab conquerors brought a new religion, Islam, and a new administrative language, Arabic. Zoroastrianism, which had shaped Iranian identity for well over 1,000 years, began a long, slow decline as the majority faith, though Zoroastrian communities have survived in Iran and in India as the Parsis to this day. For most conquered civilizations in this position, the outcome was total linguistic and cultural absorption. Egypt and Syria, for instance, became permanently and thoroughly Arabized in language over the following centuries.
Iran took a different path. Some Arab governors did try to suppress Persian language and identity outright, but having lost militarily, Iranian scribes, bureaucrats, poets, and scholars fought back culturally, from the inside. The Abbasid Caliphate, which overthrew the Umayyads in 750 AD, leaned heavily on Persian administrators. The Barmakid family, of Persian Buddhist monastic origin, is the most famous example, and adopted much of the older Sassanid model of statecraft, court ceremony, and bureaucratic organization. Persian scientific, medical, and literary scholarship flourished under Arabic script, even as spoken and later written New Persian reasserted itself. Part of this cultural counteroffensive had a name: the Shu'abiyya movement, a literary and intellectual current among Persian-speaking Muslims in the 8th and 9th centuries that explicitly pushed back against Arab claims of ethnic superiority, arguing that Persian civilization, its poetry, its statecraft, its manners, was equal to or greater than that of the Arab conquerors. It was a controversy fought almost entirely with pens rather than swords, and Iran won it. By the 10th century, local Persian-speaking dynasties, such as the Samanids in the northeast, were actively patronizing poetry and scholarship written in New Persian,
using the Arabic script, deliberately reviving a literary language for a Muslim but unmistakably Iranian elite.
The towering achievement of this revival was the poet Firdaus, who spent decades composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, a roughly 60,000 couplet epic that preserved pre-Islamic Iranian myth, legend, and royal history in a Persian language he deliberately kept as free as possible of Arabic loanwords. Completed around 1010 AD and dedicated to a Turkic sultan, the Shahnameh became something like a national scripture for Persian identity. It is still recited, quoted, and taught across Iran, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan today. Farsi didn't just survive the Arab conquest, it went on to become one of the great literary and administrative languages of the medieval Islamic world, read and written everywhere from Ottoman Anatolia to Mongol India. After the Arabs, a true catastrophe descended on Iran. In 1220, Genghis Khan's army swept in from the Central Asian steppe in retaliation for the murder of Mongol envoys and merchants by a local ruler. The Mongols did not simply conquer territory. In many cities, they massacred the population outright and destroyed ancient underground irrigation systems, qanats, that had taken centuries to build, wrecking agriculture across entire regions for generations. It looked, once again, as though Iranian civilization might simply be erased.
And then, once again, something remarkable happened. Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu, founded a Mongol successor state on Iranian soil, the Ilkhanate. Within a couple of generations, Mongol rulers who had grown up in yurts on the steppe converted to Islam, adopted Persian as the primary language of administration and court culture, funded Persian scholars, astronomers, and historians, and built grand Persian-style mosques crowned with the turquoise-blue domes that would come to define Iranian religious architecture. The conquerors had, once again, been culturally absorbed by the conquered. Toward the end of the 14th century, history repeated itself in an even more brutal form. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, swept through with an army notorious for building towers out of severed human heads in cities that resisted him. And yet Timur himself was captivated by Persian art and culture. He forcibly relocated the finest craftsmen and artisans of conquered cities back to his own capital, Samarkand. His descendants, the Timurids, went on to preside over a genuine Persian cultural renaissance, turning their courts into centers of extraordinary miniature painting, calligraphy, and poetry.
For nearly 300 years, political and military power in Iran repeatedly passed into the hands of Mongol and Turkic dynasties and warlords. And yet, generation after generation, within 1 or 2 reigns of taking the Iranian throne, these rulers were culturally reprogrammed by the civilization they had conquered. Under Ilkhanid patronage, Persian historians such as Rashid al-Din compiled sweeping world histories drawing on Mongol, Chinese, and Islamic sources, some of the most ambitious historical scholarship produced anywhere in the medieval world. Persian miniature painting absorbed Chinese artistic influence carried along Mongol-controlled trade routes, producing a new visual style that would influence art from Istanbul to Delhi for centuries. Under the Timurids in the 15th century, cities like Herat and Samarkand became magnets for poets, astronomers, and painters. The astronomer prince Ulugh Beg built one of the most advanced observatories in the pre-telescope world and produced star catalogs used by scholars for generations afterward. Conquest, in other words, kept accidentally funding a Persian cultural golden age. Out of this centuries-long churn of competing dynasties, a young leader named Ismail emerged in 1501 to reunify the Iranian plateau under a single native dynasty, the Safavids. This is a genuinely pivotal moment. Shah Ismail I made Twelver Shia Islam the compulsory state religion of Iran, a decisive break from the mostly Sunni Islamic world surrounding it, including Iran's great rival, the Ottoman Empire. For the first time in centuries, religious identity and political identity were fused together in a way that gave Iran a distinctly separate cultural and geopolitical position that persists into the present day. The Safavid-Ottoman rivalry that followed was not just political, it was also self-consciously cultural, fought over who could claim the mantle of the region's civilizational leadership. Safavid Isfahan, especially under Shah Abbas I in the early 17th century, became one of the great cosmopolitan capitals of the early modern world. Abbas relocated the capital there and rebuilt it around the enormous Naqsh-e-Jahan Square, ringed by the turquoise domes of the Shah Mosque and the Sheikh Lutfollah Mosque, the arcaded shops of the Royal Bazaar, and the Ali Kapu Palace. European travelers who visited Isfahan in this period wrote home in astonishment, comparing it favorably to the great cities of their own continent. Armenian merchants, relocated by royal decree to a new quarter called New Julfa, ran trading networks stretching to Amsterdam and Manila, making Safavid Iran a genuine hub of Eurasian commerce. Silk, carpets, and ceramics flowing outward, silver flowing in.
By the 19th century, under the Turkic Qajar dynasty, Iran entered a long period of crisis. Two disastrous wars with the expanding Russian Empire, formalized in the treaties of Gulistan, 1813, and Turkmenchai, 1828, stripped Iran permanently of territories that today make up modern Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. By the early 20th century, on the eve of the First World War, Iran had become a battlefield of influence, not always of armies, in the so-called Great Game, the long geopolitical rivalry between the British and Russian empires. In 1907, without so much as consulting the Iranian government, Britain and Russia signed a convention, formally dividing the country into a Russian sphere of influence in the north, a British sphere in the southeast, and a nominally neutral zone in between, a stark demonstration of just how little sovereignty Tehran actually retained by this point. British commercial interests, and later the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, dominated the south, increasingly focused on the newly discovered oil fields near Masjid Suleiman, the first major oil strike anywhere in the Middle East. Russian troops and advisors held sway in the north. Between 1905 and 1911, Iranians themselves tried to answer this crisis of sovereignty from within, launching the Constitutional Revolution, a genuinely popular movement of merchants, clerics, and intellectuals that forced the Qajar Shah to accept Iran's first written constitution and an elected parliament, the Majlis. It was one of the first constitutional movements anywhere in the Middle East or Asia, but foreign intervention and internal chaos repeatedly undermined it in the years that followed. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, the young Soviet Union even attempted briefly to sponsor a short-lived communist republic in Iran's northern Gilan province. The country was, in real terms, suffocating under decades of foreign pressure, unequal treaties, and internal weakness. A fully sovereign nation on paper, but one whose government could not fully control its own borders, its own resources, or at times, even its own capital. But Iran would not be Iran if it did not once again find a way to reassert itself. In 1925, an army officer named Reza Khan came to power through a military coup and was crowned Reza Shah, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. He pursued an aggressive program of centralization, industrialization, and modernization, inspired in part by Ataturk's reforms in neighboring Turkey. Then, in late 1934 and early 1935, he made a move that rippled through global diplomacy. For centuries, the Western world had called this country Persia, a name derived from the Greek term for the southern region of Pars, and by the 20th century, associated in European minds with fairy tales, carpets, and an image of romantic backwardness. Reza Shah's government sent a formal diplomatic circular to foreign governments and to the League of Nations, requesting that, beginning with the Persian New Year on March 21, 1935, the country be referred to internationally by the name its own people had used for millennia: Iran, the land of the Aryans. This was not simply a change of label, it was a statement. We are not an exotic backwater defined by foreign fantasies about our past. We are a modern, sovereign nation, and the rest of the world will address us on our own terms. The change was not without friction.
During the Second World War, Winston Churchill specifically requested that the Allies keep using Persia for a time, worried that Iran would be confused with neighboring Iraq, since both countries were occupied by Allied forces. And in 1959, Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, formally allowed both Persia and Iran to be used interchangeably, though Iran had, by then, become the dominant term worldwide.
Iran's history, again and again, is a history of sudden, radical turns. In the 20th century, the country found itself repeatedly caught between the ambitions of much larger powers. During the Second World War, despite Iran's declared neutrality, British and Soviet forces jointly invaded in August 1941 to secure a supply corridor to the Soviet Union and control the country's oil fields, forcing Reza Shah's abdication in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. A little over a decade later, in 1953, a coup organized with the involvement of British and American intelligence services removed the popularly elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, shortly after his government nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company's holdings, an episode that still shapes Iranian political memory and suspicion of Western intervention today. Under the restored and consolidated rule of Mohammad Reza Shah, Iran pursued rapid, oil-funded modernization through the 1960s and 1970s, alongside close alignment with the United States during the Cold War. But this modernization also deepened economic inequality, curtailed political freedoms, and fueled resentment among both secular reformers and the country's influential Shia clergy.
The name hasn't disappeared at all. It has taken on an almost fairy tale glow. Lost imperial grandeur, exquisite poetry, flying carpets, blue-domed mosques, a golden age frozen just out of reach.
2 names, 1 land, and a quiet, ongoing argument inside Iran and outside it over exactly how 5,000 years of history should be remembered. It's worth being honest, too, about what makes this story so unusual, rather than simply unique in an absolute sense. Iran was not the only civilization in history to culturally absorb its conquerors. China, for instance, repeatedly reshaped Mongol and Manchu rulers into Chinese-style emperors over the centuries in a strikingly similar pattern. What makes the Iran
Case so remarkable is the sheer frequency and diversity of the conquerors involved. Greek, Arab, Turkic, and Mongol, arriving from almost every direction across 2,500 years. And the fact that a single core language, Persian, and a recognizable core cultural identity survived intact through every single one of those upheavals, right down to the present day. Across 5 millennia, this civilization developed what might be the most effective survival mechanism in recorded history. When it collided with Macedonians, Arab armies, or Mongol hordes, it did not vanish. It absorbed its conquerors, one dynasty at a time, reshaping them until they governed, dressed, wrote, and prayed like Persians themselves. It stood near the very origins of organized diplomacy. It helped hand the world the idea of linear time that still structures how billions of people of every religion imagine history and the future. And perhaps its hardest battle is happening right now. Not on a battlefield, but in the space between who this civilization once was, who it is today, and how the rest of the world insists on seeing it. Because sometimes, behind the simple name of a country, there is a much quieter, much older war, the fight over its own story.